It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Welcome into the Take Command podcast. I am Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen. And Logan, there is one giant lingering question that seems to be remaining in the fan base after this NFL draft. It is about the offensive line, so we are going to talk about it this morning. Now, if we were doing the national media, it'd be like, why didn't they take a quarterback? But we're not going to do that because we're not entertaining silly narratives.
Sure.
We also are going to go around the NFL later in the show and kind of give our favorite picks, things we liked, didn't like, I guess our least favorite picks from the draft last weekend. But Logan, let's start with that offensive line question. And, you know, there's a lot of, I would say, angst, a lot of criticism about choices made around how they've built this line this offseason. This is the second straight offseason where you can say that. Where are you at with, first of all, what they did in this NFL draft, the players they took, the players they passed on, and where that leaves them now?
Well, I think, when you look at Emmanuel Forbes, I've talked about how much I like him. And I think, same thing with Quan Martin. Like, they're both really good football players. And I think one of the things I remember on draft night is, like, when they went Forbes at 16, I thought that was the right move. And the reason I'm going to say that is because Paris Johnson was off the board, Skoronski was off the board, and Darnell Wright was off the board, right? So all those guys, which I kind of had, like, that was not – Darnell Wright was a Tier 2 player for me, but definitely my first player in Tier 2. Then you get to Broderick Jones, right? I know a lot of people are very high on him, but I look at him and I say, only 19 starts, a lot of technical stuff to his game that doesn't give you the warm and fuzzies about development. He's not going to come in and be kind of a starting caliber player right away. There's going to be some lumps. I think he can get there, but it's going to take some time. And then Anton Harrison, who I was very, very high on, but again, not necessarily like a run-first tackle. Not a guy that you want kind of in there mashing around. So if those two latter guys don't give you the warm and fuzzies, and then I think everyone wanted to bring up Dawand Jones, and we'll talk about Dawand Jones in more depth here in a second. But if those guys don't give you the warm and fuzzies, then I'm not going to take Matthew Bergeron at 16, and no one's willing to trade back with me. Like, I'm going to pick my best player on the board, and for them it was Emmanuel Forbes. So I can't really, just from like my own board, I can't really fault that process.
Right.
Like that's
not to mention, they specifically wanted a playmaking defensive back because they feel like they need to generate more turnovers, and they went and got the best one in the draft.
Right.
So it's hard to be mad at that, which leaves us then to the second round in Quan Martin when Cody Mauch was drafted, one pick later?
So one pick later. And again, like, I think, depending on your evaluation of Cody Mauch, I think I like Cody. But again, the thing about pick 40, was it 47? Is that
47.
Right? 47. Is that I know, and I think Marty said this in the presser. He was like, we wanted to trade up. We wanted to get in that kind of first 15 picks of the round. And if you look at it, like, I think guys that we both agreed on would be very good fits here, Matthew Bergeron and Steve Avila were guys that they were very, very high on in that range. And I look at that and I say they just couldn't get into that spot because I think the rest of the league also valued those guys, right?
Correct.
And so those guys were the guys that I would pick at 47, undoubtedly. I think Tyler Steen might also have been in the conversation, but that would be very, very high for 47. So again, I look at my board, and it kind of was the same thing that happened at the round before. All the tackles that are worth taking are gone. I think Marty said he wanted to trade up into that range. There were no buyers, right? Because they all wanted to pick those players. Teams are smart about evaluating offensive line talent, and they overvalue offensive line talent. I don't want to take Tyler Steen at 47, and I can't now trade back. So I got up stick and pick the best player on the board. And I think that's like when I look at my tiers, and that was the funny thing about draft night, because I was crossing players off as we went, and I was disappointed, obviously. Disappointed Matthew Bergeron's gone, disappointed Steve Avila's gone. But when you're looking at the board in front of you, you're like, well, obviously Quan Martin's the best player on the board, so I'm going to take him. It was really weird going through that process and just being like, even in the first round when I thought they might go edge rusher, like all the edge rushers I would take were gone. So I'm like, well, I guess we're going corner. Who's the best one? Emmanuel Forbes, make the pick. Go through the second round. Who's the best player on my board? Quan Martin. Let's make the pick. And that's the problem. When you can't trade up, when you can't trade back, is you get stuck and you just got to take best player available. And I think they're excellent football players. That's the thing about, to me. I think they're excellent football players. I think they fit a need. It just like that's the funny thing about the draft is like people in the building at Washington, they know who the good offensive linemen are. Like when you like Ron in his interview, like he said this a couple days ago, he's like, I really wanted Darnell Wright and I really wanted Emmanuel Forbes. It's not like he didn't want an offensive lineman. He didn't think that wasn't a need. It's just the guys you had high evaluations on weren't there when you were picking. So what are you going to do? And I think that's the frustrating thing about those first two picks. I think the process is sound. It's just they couldn't get the vertical or trade back. Well, what vertical? I guess both would be vertical, right? Because you're going forward and backward, right?
Yeah.
Get that kind of trade back momentum. So I understand that's frustrating to fans, but when you look at the board, like I don't know what else you're going to do.
Yeah. I will take one final victory lap on the Carson Wentz trade here. That was a huge problem for them in this draft. Because
it's a dagger, isn't it?
It's
a dagger.
I mean, thank God that he didn't hit the snap threshold and you're out your second. But that third round pick that they were missing was massive because you had no picks for 50 picks. You had 47 and you had 97. And when you look at a guy like Quan Martin, who a lot of people think they may have reached on, you can't risk him not being there at, what would have been 70 something.
I think, I'm really glad you brought that up. That's a great point.
Because if he's your guy, which they really like him, that he was the guy that they were targeting in the second round, if those offensive linemen were gone, like there's no chance he's there at 97. And so, you can't play around and you can't trade up as much.
To your point, like if you're picking at night, if you're picking in that, at what is it? Like the 16th pick of the next round, like you could have probably drafted an offensive lineman at that spot and feel pretty good, like taking a reach or whatever trade capital. Like there's so many different things that pop up there that again, I totally agree with you. Like it was just such a long like drought of not picking 50 picks, man. That's so long that you got to kind of make a decision. And like the fact that you couldn't get into the meat of the third round there, I think was also probably a little frustrating for everybody. So this is a perfect example. So people ask me like, why didn't they pick Osiris Torrance? Because he went later in the second round. And I did not have a very high grade on Osiris Torrance. I mean, I liked him, but I had Cody Mock and Steve Avila higher than him, and again, he's a big guy that doesn't quite fit most NFL schemes, right? To your point, Craig, if you are picking at 47, a name that I just would like to call attention to is Wanye Morris out of Oklahoma. After he was like the next guy after that top tier guys, right? I think he went 92. Is that right? No, that's not right. Something like that. He went to Kansas City. Let's see where he is right here on the board.
He went the third round?
Yeah, third round, 92. 29th pick of the third round. Yep. So that's a player that you could have easily targeted at the 16th pick in that round and been totally fine with. So that's something, again, like just not having that pick, good offensive lineman, a guy that's perfect value for Wanye at that 16th pick in the third round. You just don't have an opportunity to do it. And, I don't know what their evaluation was on Wanye, but like Tyler Steen went really early in the second, so you miss out on him. I think he's an excellent football player. I really liked his film. But the next guy on my list is Wanye, and you're just in this drought of picks. So that's the thing that's frustrating to me too, right? I think is that Carson Wentz trade really inhibits your effectiveness in that round, and in the third round specifically.
And that's what you get for making a trade when you're doing silly stuff by bargaining against yourself. Like nobody else was trading for Carson Wentz. They paid a tax to do it, and for some reason gave up insanely high draft capital. So dumb. So dumb. It was dumb then. It stays dumb now. And even if you liked the idea of bringing Carson in at the time, like that part is not hindsight. That is something that's like, why are you giving up this much draft capital? And by the way, the Colts ultimately take Josh Downs at that pick, a receiver that a lot of people really, really like. So they get a good football player. And also, I will say, this is salt in the wounds. So Commanders fans, I'm sorry. If you want to be really, really sad today, go look at what ultimately the Eagles got in exchange for Carson Wentz compared to what the Commanders got out of Carson Wentz. Yikes. I think some of the I think Jalen Carter's a direct line from the Carson Wentz trade.
Yes, direct line. It's crazy.
It's nuts. But overall, like I think that the board fell in a way where they didn't have opportunities to take the tackle that everybody wanted them to take. And I will say this when it comes to, okay, so the third round, their compensatory pick finally comes along. They take Ricky Stromberg. I think everyone's pretty happy about that. He's a guy that potentially starts this season. But then
Yeah.
with Braden Daniels, there's obviously a lot of consternation. And I said this to a caller on the radio yesterday. I'm kind of reserving judgment on that pick because he has something that you can't teach, and he's lacking things that can be added, mainly
Right.
weight, right? If
Yeah.
you're like, oh, this guy's too small, well, currently he's your fourth tackle. So you got your two starters, and then you got Cornelius Lucas, and you could still add someone potentially in free agency if there's another Charles Leno situation. But you got a guy who's got really excellent foot, not necessarily footwork, but foot speed,
Yeah.
and that you can't really teach. And
Yeah.
so if you can clean up his footwork in terms of technique, you can get him in a weight room. Like, is he a future starter at tackle? Hopefully.
Yeah.
And maybe he's a swing tackle and that's where he caps out. And if you get a
Just
swing
fine.
tackle in the fourth route, honestly, like that's a good use of your pick. But I do think that there's a little bit of consternation around the offensive line that negates a reality that they've done a lot to change this offensive line. Because that's
Right.
the final point I'll make real quick, Logan, is like people obviously are correct in saying they did not address this O-line enough, and what they had at the end of last year or throughout last year was not good enough. Well, they've got 4 new offensive linemen, if you count Cosme as new because he's going to a new position. They have a new quarterback, and the quarterback was a huge part of their offensive line problems last year, and a new coordinator, and the way this was schemed up was an enormous problem in terms of their protection last year. So you might not be, and this is where you start to pick nits a little bit, is like folks can be upset about the fact that they don't like the solutions that the Commanders have come up with. And if you have strong opinions on that at this time without seeing games played, okay, but you don't know that you're right any more than they know that they're right? We just don't know, but that's the fun of, doing what we do, is like we give our best guess and then ultimately we'll find out. But people can't pretend like they haven't done anything. They have 4 new offensive
Yeah.
linemen, a new quarterback, and a new coordinator. Like, they've made significant changes. Let's just be honest about the fact that a lot of people don't like the changes.
Yeah. And I think going back to the draft for a second, and I think the changes are good. I think, Wiley's a good football player. I think Cosme at guard, I think he probably projects better there. The center thing is unusual to me. Like, because again, I've been a part of systems my whole career where center is not really like a high value spot. And I know Chase Roulier's future is a little in flux, but you have 4 centers on the roster right now. Like Ron basically in his presser today was like, I don't see Gates playing guard. I see him playing center. So it's like, that's really unusual to have 4 guys that are just playing center, I think. Then at the left guard spot, so center, I guess by that logic should be shored up pretty good. So 3 guys you feel pretty good about. Left guard, obviously a little bit up in the air. They got a little bit of a
Yeah,
competition
that's
there.
the one where, what the hell are they doing? I don't know. You better hope Chris
And-
Paul's good.
The thing about the pick at 97 that gets the wheels turning is Dawand Jones is still on the board at that point. And, I know Dawand Jones, like there was some weight concerns, there were some character concerns, there was a medical concern, which is why a guy at the Senior Bowl who looked like a top 5 player is there in the 3rd round. And so my question to fans and to you, Craig, is the risk of that player worth the 97th pick for a guy who has top 5 talent when and if he is in shape and he's ready to play football? You know what I'm saying? Because and I look at that and I say,
Right.
he's a starter. He's like I don't want to compare him to Trent Williams, but he's in that top group of tackles that we just talked about that they missed on. He's sitting there at 97. I'm not totally convinced that Stromberg is not there when you're picking in the 4th round. So if you went Dawand Jones there and then Stromberg in the 4th, like, how do you feel about that? I know we just talked about the upside of Braden Daniels, and we've talked about on this show, after the pick, tremendous athlete. You see flashes of that elite kind of Trent Williams athleticism. It's super inconsistent, but it's there. So the projection's there, but it, like you just said, I think you said it very nicely. There's a projection element that he's going to be a swing tackle kind of at best in his career. Probably, I think, moves to guard at some point. as opposed to getting a guy in Dawand Jones who has these kind of off-field character concerns, but could be his ceiling is, top 10 offensive lineman in the NFL. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that and like how you weigh the risk and reward there. Because, again, like I don't have access to all the interviews, to all the medical stuff, but it was enough that I talked to one of my buddies for a different team that they took him off the board completely. And so is there when does the risk outweigh the value or whatever that relationship is?
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, the lower, when does the risk threshold get crossed, basically? Because the lower the pick, like if you take him in the 7th rounder and he bombs out, like who cares? That's kind of, guys bomb out because they're not talented all the time. If they bomb out for a different reason, like there's no penalty for that for you as a team, unless there's some kind of embarrassing situation that you have to deal with. But to me, you said something key in there that makes this really difficult to answer, because on a talent standpoint, it's 100% worth it. And if Stromberg's not there, like was Whippler still there? And like
Whippler went in the 5th.
Yeah, so Whippler's
they
there,
like but they like bigger centers, and Stromberg is more their type.
Sure, but so, and again, this
is not an indictment of Stromberg in any way. I think Stromberg's an excellent football player, really, really good football player. But I tend to value tackle more than I value center, especially for a team that's got a bunch of them. And it's not only here, but it's like even with the Braden Daniels pick, like Carter Warren out of Pittsburgh was taken 2 picks later, who's also kind of more of a traditional tackle. He has a medical concern, but when you looked at him play his 4 games last year before the injury, people were talking about him being a top 60 pick. So you have these 2 tremendously high upside players, one that could have been a top 10 kind of talent and one that's for sure a top 60 talent when he's healthy. But there's the injury risk with one, and then there's some character concerns with the other. So obviously, Washington chose to go a different direction. I just want to get your thoughts on that, Craig.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing there that you mentioned again is the medical. And that's where it's not very exciting podcasting or radio or television, but like you just got to throw your hands up and be like, I don't know if he's hurt. Like if there's a medical red flag and he's off the board, then like he's off the board. Yeah. And you don't put guys back on the board because they're all of a sudden a better value. Like you took them off the board for medical for a reason, or potentially for character for a reason.
Right. I think with Dawand Jones, it's more character. Yeah, it's more character stuff. But and weight concerns, I would assume, just talking to people around the league, no one, because it's all HIPAA stuff, so no one's going to definitively say, oh, whatever. But there's like undertones of he looked kind of big at his pro day or whatever. You know what I mean? Like from other people that I've talked to, and so I'm sure there's other stuff. He had extended medical interview at the combine, right? So there's obviously something going on. We just don't know what exactly it is,
Right. And so I would say if the medical is not red flagged, right? If the medical doesn't take him off the board, it's 100% worth it. And you're 100% correct. And I think that is a fair and valid criticism. And, the kid from Pitt, like, it was torn ACL, right, for him?
Yeah. Week 4. So he's like pretty good in terms of timetable, I think.
Yeah, like as long as he's healed, like what are we doing? Like take him. That one doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But again, that's without seeing the medical. Maybe there's something in that medical and in the recovery, or they're scared that based off of this, that, or the other thing that he's at risk to do it again. Or they think that he's not going to make a full recovery to the peak of his skill set, and he's going to be a diminished version of himself. And if that's the case, then like I don't really have a lot of ammo to argue back against it. Right. But like you said, like I would much rather have taken a value high upside tackle and then Stromberg in the 4th, or another center maybe in the 4th, than do what they did if that's the case. I wonder with Jones specifically how bad some of this stuff is, whether it is medical or character, where they just someone talks to him and it's just like, I can't coach this kid. Like it's not going to work for him. He doesn't get how to be a pro, and it's not, the talent is tantalizing, but like potential gets you fired, and I'm not going to mess with it. I'd rather have someone who's going to come in, work hard, and actually be in the league for 10 years versus a guy that's going to flame out after 4 because he's not willing to put in the work, or it's not worth the energy that we have to put in to keep him healthy and on the field because he just doesn't do the things that he needs to do. And like, it's kind of, if you can't do the work to stay physically in shape, how can we trust you to do the work to digest the playbook and do the things that you need to do mentally to play at the NFL level, where you can't rely on your talent because the guy across from you is always as talented as you are, and as big and as strong and as fast. And so there's
a history of offensive tackle, big offensive tackles with weight issues in college, continuing to have weight issues in the pros. And I will say at the Senior Bowl, he came in at 370 and he looked amazing. He looked like, again, like a top 5 player. Like he looked awesome. But I remember watching when we were still doing the pregame show, we
Mhm.
watched Dawand Jones. Remember, we
Yep,
watched
we
him
did.
late in the season. He looked like he was about 420 pounds, right? He looked enormous and heavy. And like you cannot, like that 420-pound Dawand Jones is not going to be a
It's not blocking Von Miller.
right. But 370, oh yeah, man, it's a party now. You know what I'm saying? But how often is he going to be 370? And I guess the other question is 420-pound Dawand Jones better? Does he have more upside than Braden Daniels? That's a kind of an unknowable question in my opinion. But again,
Yeah.
like this is the type of stuff where like interviews become so important. And everyone, I've gotten a lot of questions about Dawand Jones being there. The other thing I want to say is they drafted a lot of guys that they had top 30 visits with. And Dawand Jones, his top 30 visit fell through. And I bet, I don't know this, but I'd be willing to bet a lot of money it was because he was out of shape and they were going to have him get on a scale and he wasn't in shape. That's what my gut tells me, hearing all this stuff about him. So again, like there's a interpersonal relationship here with these players that the coaches have to have, which you highlighted beautifully there. So again, like I know it's frustrating and people get mad when they're like, oh, so and so didn't pick so and so player, but there's all this other stuff there that makes it a little bit more complicated. And potential is tantalizing, like you said, but it also gets you fired, which I think is a very good point.
Yeah, and it's a little bit, if you can't even stay in shape during the draft interview process, it's a little bit like how weed testing was, or maybe Steven still is.
Yes, right.
Where it's like hey, guy, they'd only test like over a 2-month period. And you can't.
It's shorter than that.
And as soon as they test you, you don't get tested twice. So you can celebrate being tested with the biggest blunt you've ever smoked in your life, and you're going to be fine. You're not going to get suspended for marijuana use in the NFL. And it's kind of, I don't want to use this phrase, but I'm going to use it because I've heard it used by like front office people and coaches. It's like it's kind of a big giant idiot test. Like
yes,
how,
dude, 100%.
like it's just, hey man, don't for a couple weeks, just relax. Just you don't need it. It'll be fine. If football means anything to you, you can lay off. To Stephen A. Smith, lay off the weed for a couple of weeks in the off season.
It's like there's a running back who played for Minnesota back in like the 80s, and basically people were knocking him because they thought he had other interests outside of football. And, I saw him give an interview. He was like, oh, yeah, I basically said, like, I was thinking about going back to school. I was thinking about doing all these other things. And in my mind, I'm like, you are dumb. Like, I know you're thinking about going back to school. You think about get your master's, your doctorate, whatever. But lie. Be like, football is the most important thing in my life right now. Boom. End of sentence. Like, it's just like they just want – it's a test. Just give them the answer they want to hear. Like, stay in shape for 3 weeks. You know what I mean? Like, keep your weight down. And you're a first round pick, and you're swimming in money, right? Answer that question correctly, and you're a first round pick. Like that's the thing that gets me about this process. But if a guy says that to me in an interview where I'm his potential employer, and he says, "Oh yeah, football is kind of like third thing I'm most interested. I'm interested." I'm like, I don't want that guy here because I want someone who it's important to. So that always drives me nuts. It's like it's weeding out stupidity. It's weeding out ignorance, I think is what I would say. And like, that's an important part of the process, quite frankly.
I don't know if a guy's going for his doctorate, I'm looking at that as a market inefficiency. I'm like, other teams are going to hate that. I'm going to take that guy and I'm going to get a
later.
Stud.
But you can take him later though, right?
That's also true. That's
right?
also true.
He's doing whatever he's doing. So I think that's the thing, just to kind of put a bow on it is I know there were these other players around there, but there was medical red flags on both, character red flags on one for sure, character weight, whatever you want to call that. And so again, Braden Daniels, awesome leader, 4-year starter, very in the type of guy that they want here. So just kind of to flesh that out, like they have a type. And I think if you're being a little bit conservative, you always want to bet on the high character guy because they're going to develop and get better at football. So
yeah.
And he does have athletic upside, to be fair.
Yeah.
I don't want to dissuade that at all.
Totally. And like, I'd rather trust Braden Daniels to put on 15 pounds than Dawand Jones to lose 30.
Correct.
And that's kind of the bet that they're making. And at that point, it's a no-brainer. I do think the kid out of Pittsburgh is a super, super interesting one. That one I'd love to know more about.
Yeah, I don't know that much about him.
Medical or
because that's kind of
whatever.
where people thought he was going to go in that range.
Yeah.
And I just wonder if, they didn't love the medical or if there was some character stuff. I know he didn't play like the COVID year. Like there was a lot of stuff about him that was kind of just unfortunate, like nothing to knock him against. But I know that kind of might have rubbed some teams the wrong way, just like from 1,000
teams like their boxes checked nice and neatly.
Yeah, especially when
anything
you're
that upsets
drafted
the
again.
apple cart. Yeah,
Right.
They're not about that life. Where does that leave? Let's do like 1 minute on this. Where does that leave them now? Do you think they can enter camp / the season with what they have, or do they need to bring in at least one or two more players along this line?
Yeah, so I would say, okay, there's two universes running parallel, and we're going to talk about them in a minute. One, Braden Daniels is a tackle, right? Then you have 4 tackles on the roster. While that's not ideal, you can make that work. Sadiq can play tackle. There's some position flexibility. Right. If Braden Daniels is not a tackle, then you definitely need to bring another body in, just someone to occupy that position during training camp, right? Hopefully someone with a little bit of upside, and I think they're going to give Braden Daniel every opportunity to do that because, like I said, he does have special athletic upside, so I want to see that too. I want to give him the shot to make that happen. But I'm always like, tackles are super hard to find. They're just hard. It's hard to find big athletic dudes who can move at and occupy the space requirements of the tackle position. So if there's someone that comes available, I'm bringing them in. And I'm really hoping that Chris and Sadiq develop. And if not, Norwell's going to be the starter. Like, that's kind of what I'm looking at. And I think you feel okay about that. I mean, he's a top 40 guard in the NFL. He's a top 40 guard.
But he's a lot closer to 40 than he is to 15.
Correct. But, like, that's okay. Average O-line play, get you by. C's get degrees, man. It's the same thing with offensive line play. If the 5 guys cohese and they do a good job together, you can get by. And I'm hoping, and I think Ron thinks this, he hasn't told me this, I'm just, Nostradamusing this, but Sam Howell getting the ball out quicker and EB calling plays is going to elevate that group in a way that was not elevated last year. So I think that's kind of what you're looking at. He's looking at a projection not only from a personnel standpoint, but also from a play calling quarterback play standpoint. So I think, and we've talked about that before. So that's what I think, but I'm always sniffing around for, a high value guard, a high value tackle that hits the market that just I can plug in there. And that's kind of what I'm looking at.
I am very much hoping that another guard is brought in. I think Norwell's going to get cut.
Maybe.
I hope that someone else is brought in. All the tea leaves seem to say that, and by tea leaves I mean things that Ron says out loud into microphones. Because he keeps conveniently, he keeps conveniently forgetting Norwell, and when he's always like, yeah, Chris and Sadiq are going to battle it out, and everyone's like, hey, what about Norwell? It's like, oh, he's still here.
It's like Norwell too. Yeah.
Martin, have we not cut him yet? What is? I thought we talked about this. You said you were going to tell him that he's going to leave the party. Why is he still here?
Right.
God, that shirt is hideous. Anyway. Take Command podcast from Odyssey Sports. I'm Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulson. If you're watching us on YouTube, hit that like button for us. We'd very much appreciate that. And subscribe to the channel that you're watching on right now. And if you're listening, just, take out your phone and hit follow if you're in Spotify. Subscribe if you're in Apple Podcast if you haven't done so you do not miss an episode. All right, let's go around the NFL, the rest of the league, see what we think about their draft. We're not going to go through like every team or anything. Anthony and I did do that on the radio show. If folks want to check that out on our YouTube page or in our podcast
feed for
the Hoffman Show.
Damn.
Yeah, we went past. We did it after the first round. We did pass fail grades for every single team, which was kind of fun. But we did
only the first round though, right?
Yeah, we did some winners and losers, but we didn't do every team. So who are your favorite picks, favorite teams, how they did it this past weekend?
I mean, this is going to sound super lame, but the Philadelphia Eagles, I mean, they just played their board. They traded up for the best player in the draft, and again, it goes back to that Carson Wentz, situation and them getting a really good football player and having opportunities to take more bites at the apple. And I feel like they don't reach. They're very good. They're very efficient. And I just think that's good process, Nolan Smith, that's a crazy pick. Tyler Steen, an offensive lineman I love that fills a need for him. Sidney Brown, one of my favorite players in the entire draft, like that kind of box safety with, I think, some post upside. Keely Ringo in the 4th round. I didn't like him, but again, to get that kind of athlete with that kind of upside in the 4th round, I mean, like, I just love their evaluation. I love how the board fell for them. I think that, Howie Roseman deserves a ton of credit, and I don't know. Like it's hard to argue with this draft. They get Tanner McKee, a backup quarterback. More Ogiomi from Texas was a guy that I thought had some really good pass rush juice on the inside. He's their 7th round pick. A lot of people had him a 4th round grade. People I was talking to. So the fact that happens, like, I mean, they get really good football players, really good value at every level of the draft. And I also want to point out, they had 2 third-round picks, which allows them to get those 2, Tyler Steen and Sidney Brown. And again, you were talking about this earlier, Craig, with the desert of a 3rd round for the Commanders. And like there were a lot of good football players here, late 2nd, early 3rd, and I think they were able to, Philly was able to capitalize on that big time. So,
yeah, I'll say this about the Eagles draft though. I do think it probably won't be as genius as it looks right now, even if it's very good. And what I mean by that is Howie Roseman did the thing that if you want job security and you're an NFL GM, you should absolutely do, which is take the guys everyone's heard of. You go based off like the consensus big board. And I'm not saying that the consensus big boards are wrong or that whatever, but like everyone loves the story of, wow, he took all these Georgia players. Like, wow, look, Jalen Carter might be the best player in the draft. And part of the reason he might actually pan out is because he goes to a system in Philadelphia that can absorb his character and get the most out of him. You're not going into a room with Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham and not reaching your potential. Those dudes are going to be on you. And they're pros and they know what they're doing and they know how to get the best out of their teammates. You've seen it with Josh Sweat and Hassan Riddick. Like those guys younger coming up, getting mentored by some of the best in the business and some of the best pros in the business is going to help these players, whether it is a Keely Ringo, whether it is a Jalen Carter, be the best versions of themselves. But you also, like the chances that all these guys hit and like Nolan Smith works out at 238 and Jalen Carter puts it together. And Keely Ringo is the guy that we saw as a freshman, not the guy we saw in the 2 years since they got him dropped all the way to the 4th round. Like it's probably not going to bat 1,000, but people are psyched about it because of the name value.
Well, for me, it's like the thing that makes the draft. Obviously, the name value is big. The thing that makes the draft are the 2 third-round picks.
Mm-hmm.
Brown,
which are players that a lot of media folks also loved, but they might also
Yeah.
love them for good reason. Like
they're good football players. They're good football players, and I think that's why I'm high on them. Right? Is because like I think Tyler Steen's going to fill a need for them right now. He's played a ton of football. He would have been a perfect fit here in Washington. Loved him. Like very very high floor type of pick. Brown again, like one of those box guys, great attitude. Like a guy you just want to bet on. So from a gambling standpoint, they might have incurred a lot of risk with the first 2 picks, but I feel like they were like, all right, we have this risk with the first 2. Let's be safe here. Went back to a little bit risky, but I think the reason the draft is good for me is because they got 2 guys that are going to start for them, quite frankly, in the 3rd round. And I think that's exactly what you want to do. And again, I go back to Washington not having really a 3rd round pick till later, and that's one of the reasons why that hurts them. So.
Yeah, definitely. Like again, if they only hit on, let's say they got 7 guys. I don't know how many they actually got, but they got 7 guys. If they hit on 5 of them to the level that people think they might have, like that's still an incredible draft.
Yeah.
But it is kind of funny to watch people freak out over everything the Eagles do because it becomes a little bit of a snowball effect.
Yes.
And look,
absolutely.
I have certainly praised what they've done because what they've done is incredible from a process standpoint. But we'll see how it ultimately pans out.
Right.
But we'll see isn't very exciting radio or podcast.
But it's true. It's like, I got one thing I got to say. The thing I hate more than anything in the entire draft is post-draft grades. I cannot stand that stuff. It's like you have no idea. You're grading based on your evaluation. But like, so person A has evaluation, person B has evaluation. They're going to give you a completely different grade. And these guys haven't played a down of NFL football yet. Like, oh my gosh, it pisses me off so bad. But that's a conversation for another day. Sorry.
I mean, it's kind of like what we're doing, just a different version. We're just willing to have a nuance and not put a grade on it.
But like when I see like, so for example, like 2012, right? Seattle Seahawks gets an F from Bleacher Report, their draft. They drafted Bruce Irvin in the first round, Bobby Wagner in the third, Bobby Wagner in the second, Russell Wilson in the third. Like, they have 2 Hall of Fame players almost in that draft, and one guy who played for 15 years in the NFL. Come on, man. Like, what are we doing? We don't know. And so, like, again, like, I think what we're doing is we're providing context here in a way that is not F, A, B, C, D, E, whatever. Like, we're saying Jalen Carter, best before the draft, best talent in the draft. Character concerns, which make that a little bit risky, but I think it's worth the risk at 9. Same thing with Nolan Smith. He's a top 15 athletic talent, falls to you at 30, seems like good value.
Yep.
2 good players in the
that,
third.
To me, that's what a grade is about. It's like,
Right.
what kind of value did you get?
Right.
But also, like, I've talked about a lot on the radio this week, and we talked about earlier in the week, like, people are killing the Commanders because they took Quan Martin because they think it's bad value. But, like, I had Matt Miller on the show on Monday, and he's like, on my board, he was lower, but I get why they took him and have no problem with it because he fits
Right.
what they do. I'm not.
Right.
I'm a scheme agnostic, like, board setter because
Person,
I don't run a football team. But that, players are going to slide up and down based off of what they do for your team, and that, that's a good pick, even though it seems based off my board like a reach.
And again,
so yeah,
I said he was the highest player on my board at 47, and that's because I try to fit my board to Washington
for the Commanders.
So it seems like the right fit. You know what I'm saying? So that's again where I would say, like, the national people don't quite understand, and he might be a bust. Who knows? I don't think so. But, like,
sure,
it might not work out, and I'm willing to acknowledge that. So
that'd be fun. That'd be a fun exercise, actually, to go back and be like, all right, we're gonna once a week for the next couple of weeks, starting in like 2015, actually do draft grades.
Yes,
go back,
dude.
See
absolutely.
how they did in hindsight. All right, so other draft winners, losers, etc. I love what Arizona did. They had a guy that they would have taken happily at 3 with Paris Johnson. They trade back to 12, then trade back up to 6. And in doing so, get a future first out of Houston, which might be the best pick in the draft next year. A draft that is loaded at quarterback in a year where if they are also drafting the top of the draft, they could have the first 2 picks and be looking to replace Kyler Murray. So it is like, the funny thing is, I think we disagree on Houston, which we can talk about in a second. But I love what Arizona did, getting Paris Johnson, getting that extra first-round pick. I got to look at what else they did in the draft, but I was a huge fan specifically of that move because I think Johnson's the right guy, and I think the way they were able to do the thing that we talk about doing when we do our mock drafts of like, we're going to trade down here, then let's trade back up and trade. Like, they actually did it in real life. And by the way, I also like a lot of their next couple picks. Ojulari in the second round, one of the better edges in the draft. Garrett Williams, obviously I love him because he went to Syracuse. And by the way, congrats to Michael Wilson, the second pro athlete in his relationship, because I think I mentioned this. His girlfriend is the best player in the National Women's Soccer League, Sophia Smith. So kind of cool to watch that play out over the weekend. He goes like, she's been a pro for like 3 years because she went pro at like 19. But congrats to Michael Wilson out of Stanford. And then, they get John Gaines too out of UCLA, who a lot of people really, really like in the 4th round. So I really like what Arizona did from value standpoint, player selection standpoint, and getting that future one from Houston next year, which could be very easily. I would bet on, if you tell me top 5 pick or later, I'm taking top 5 pick with Houston, the way Houston set up this year.
No, absolutely. And I think this feels like I think this gets thrown around a lot, but a franchise changing type of move, right? You get some really good football players this year. You add draft capital next year and a draft piece that's going to be probably a top 5 pick. And think about the draft capital you can accrue off of that. Think about what Philly did. Every time they got that first round pick and then traded out of the spot, they just added value and the ripples effect of that piece. And so again, like I like Arizona. I like they were able to do that. Got the player they wanted. Got more stuff. I don't hate. I mean, I strongly dislike what Houston did as kind of the mirror effect of that. So, and again, so Arizona did a good job. I think Houston, with where that roster's at, they needed to make Are we talking about things we don't like, or can we talk about this now, or should we
Yeah,
wait?
I mean, let's talk about Houston real quick, and then I want to talk about Detroit to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. So Houston, just it bugs the heck out of me, because what is the actual percentage difference between Will Anderson and Tyree Wilson, or Will Anderson and Lucas Van Ness? Like, what is the actual percentage difference to your roster? And in that roster as it exists right now, I'm going to say not very much. Now, in 3 years, maybe Will Anderson will be better. He'll have a better supporting staff. I do think he has a higher upside. But also, I'm saying I need more people to fill this out. I need more youth. I need more talent. I need to just upgrade everything. So, and you're giving away picks, for one player, and I just don't think that's good process, quite frankly. And that really was confounding to me, I think, and something that I found very frustrating, honestly.
Yeah. So this is I look at the trade as trading for CJ Stroud, not for trading for Will Anderson. If you will, right? Obviously, they ultimately take Stroud second and Anderson third, but they had to already be in discussions and know that was in the works, and they could have easily flipped that. This entire thing for Houston hinges on how much you like CJ Stroud and if CJ Stroud works out. Because I think one of the things you can do with draft capital is move up and target guys, and they did that. They had I think 12 picks initially. They wind up taking like 7 or 8. And literally every pick after Stroud is involved in a trade in some form or fashion, but they get the guys they want. And if you are
Yeah.
right on those, you have built a foundation for your roster. And the thing about Anderson that I love, admittedly, and why I would have taken him, over Stroud, my own personal opinion, is like he's the culture setter for the franchise. Tyree Wilson's not that. Lucas Van Ness probably is not that either. But Will Anderson, I'll steal this quote. I don't remember who Landry said it, but Landry Locker, who hosts on our sister station down in Houston, said this on my show. It's like D'Amico Ryans drafting D'Amico Ryans. And to get that
Yeah.
leader and tone setter, culture setter for your franchise, even if it doesn't make you a good football team this year, okay. That's why I would have taken Anderson and figured out quarterback next year, knowing that I was probably bad this year. If you love Stroud, though, okay, you get your quarterback, and then you don't have to worry about it as much next year. That's where it hurts, though, because the chances are, even if Stroud works out, he's not going to be very good this year, and you probably gave him a top 5 pick in one of the most quarterback-rich drafts in recent memory, in terms of how it's projecting out. And even if you don't need quarterback next year, to be able to trade out of that pick and get more capital, that hurts. So that's kind of where I lose the pro Houston argument. Is like I don't mind if you get your quarterback and your future team captain and the 2 and 3, those are picks well spent.
Right.
But from a value standpoint, I do think giving up a pick next year, unless you think that you have the ability to be in middle of the pack team this year on the ascent, is probably a huge mistake.
I totally agree. And that's the thing that really bothers me about it. It's not this year. There's nothing wrong with Will Anderson. It's just like, does he move the needle more than the pick you're going to have next year, the trade opportunity you're going to have next year, where you can, maybe get a good football player from another team. You can trade back into the meat of a round, get more first round capital for the year after. It just seems like you could have built this team for 3 years off of this one pick, and I think that's why I feel so good about what Arizona did. And I'm kind of like Houston, scratching my head a little bit, because they didn't need to take Van Ness or anything like that. They could have traded up for Darnell Wright. They could have traded up for, Paris Johnson, had him play guard. They could have done a million things to help this group be a little bit better. And I guess maybe I was not as high on Will Anderson as being like definitively the number one defensive player. But obviously they were. So I think that's something that, I'm not going to second guess that, but I do think the draft capital thing is something I'm always like, that's gonna bite you in the butt, I think, moving forward. So,
yeah. All right. So last but not least, let's talk about the Lions, the most interesting team in the draft, probably. I do think their GM Brad Holmes should probably stop talking a little bit when he talks about we would have taken Jahmyr Gibbs at 6. It's like, are you taking him over Bijan? Okay, that's
maybe
that.
I can see
Please
that, honestly.
tell us more about how you have all the information. I mean,
So what I'd
I
say,
know Jahmyr Gibbs is really good, and I know he's flexible and kind of fits a mold for what they want in that offense. I don't even hate them taking him as high as they did. The Jack Campbell one, I have a little bit harder time justifying, but it's they play by their own rules, and if they're right, they're going to look like geniuses, and if they're wrong, then Brad Holmes is going to be out of a job and probably never be a GM in the NFL again.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree with this, but I can see what they're talking about because I do think Jahmyr Gibbs fits the NFL in its current iteration a little bit better than Bijan Robinson. Like he's a satellite player, he catches the ball exceptionally well. He's like a receiver, running back. He's great in space. He runs outside zone well. So I kind of get what he's saying. Like, do I think he's probably hyping it up a little bit? Probably, but I kind of, if you tilt your head and look at it, you're like, okay, maybe. But I think that's a little high for running back, right?
Yeah.
But again, in a draft that's kind of devoid of offensive horsepower, I think that's one of the reasons why you feel okay with that at 12.
Yeah, I think you also have to think of him as like receiver running back, right?
Like
He's the guy that's
playmaker.
going to
Like
get
he's a
15 to
playmaker.
20. Yeah, they'll line him up 15 to 20 touches a game. He's going to line up in the slot. He's going to line up in the backfield. They're going to do a lot of different stuff with him.
He's fast. He's really explosive. Like
Home run hitter, yeah.
I'd love it even better if Williams was going to be there, the kid from Alabama that got caught gambling. He's only going to miss 6 games, but like that offense with those pieces in there, that's a scary proposition to me. That's so much speed. That offense totally changes from kind of this smash mouth, grind you out to a team that can just take the top off at any moment. They have people that can win one-on-one matchups. So long and short, I do like the pick. It still seems a little high at 12, but I think that's just because you're thinking of him as a running back and not necessarily like a playmaker.
Right. But the Jack Campbell one is that one's harder to explain.
Dude, I absolutely love Jack Campbell. I love him. So part of me is like, you got the best linebacker in the class. You got a guy, talk about a culture setter. Like, holy cow, leader, smart, very Dan Campbell-esque in terms of pick, just mindset. 18, they both seem high. But again, in a linebacker class that's weak, Dan Campbell was like a guy unto himself. Like I was like, man, I would
Jack
love
Campbell.
it.
Dan Campbell, also a man unto himself.
But Jack Campbell was
Yeah.
on an island by himself, and he was one of the best linebackers that I'd watched last 4 or 5 years. Just his college film and what they were asking him to do, and that's including like Micah Parsons. Like Micah Parsons was so raw at Penn State, and Jack Campbell was like the opposite.
Well, let me ask you this then, because another linebacker that went in that same range a couple years ago is a guy named Jamin Davis, who people were like, oh, he's overdrafted, but like major upside. Like, I don't think people freaked out in the way that they freaked out about Campbell. Who's a better prospect, Campbell or Davis?
That's a great question. I think Campbell's a better prospect, honestly.
Okay,
you know what I mean?
If that's the case, then okay, fine. I guess we're wrong about 18.
He's ready to play. Like he's like the best way I've been able to describe him. I had to write an article about him. Is he is Dick Butkus and Luke Kuechly, like if they had like a child somehow, right? Just like this hyper physical brute, but also hyper instinctive intellect that you see from Kuechly. He's been training with Kuechly. Like I think he has the potential to be something very special. I still thought he would go at 47. So I thought Washington maybe would go linebacker there and pick this guy. But obviously, like Fred said it to me the other day, and Fred says some crazy stuff, Smoot. But basically, like if he's your favorite guy, like take him at 18. I'm like, well, trade back, do something, get out of that spot. Because like if the consensus board is, and you don't know for sure, so I'm willing to acknowledge that. But if I can get him at 25, that pick looks way better, And again, it doesn't matter because I love Jack Campbell, I love Jahmyr Gibbs, I love both of those players. Like they're so good, they're so fun to watch. They're going to be excellent pros, but it just seems a little rich just based on the value of middle linebacker and the value of running back in the NFL. So,
yeah. And then they ultimately take Hooker, right? Later in that draft.
So they actually had a really nice draft. They had Sam Laporta, who was probably
that's one of your favorites.
A really good football player, really nice playmaker. Brian Branch in the second round. Again, like this is where I think it's interesting. You see teams with 2 seconds. Detroit has 2/3, right? You're able to get really good football players. Hendon Hooker is like a value pick in the 3rd round. And then Broderick Martin, the huge defensive tackle out of Western Kentucky. Like you just get people that are filling out your roster, and like that's awesome. And I think like again, those 2 seconds, 2/3, that kind of saves their draft, in my opinion, because you get guys who are going to be good, solid role players on your team. And I think you get two really excellent football players, even if they are a reach at 12 and 18.
Yeah. On Branch, by the way,
Yeah.
Martin Mayhew said in the press conference he wishes he had been a little more aggressive in places trading up.
Yeah.
He goes 3 picks before the Commanders take Martin. Do you wonder if that's one of the guys that he wishes he had maybe been a little more aggressive, trade up a couple picks and get in front of Detroit for Branch instead of taking Martin?
So looking at that second round, I actually had, for this team, to be clear, I had a higher grade on Quan for this team because of the position flexibility, because he can play true nickel, he can play the post, he can play in the box. And when I was talking to teams around the league about Branch, I got kind of some weird feedback. And a lot of teams said, he's excellent, but I think he's only a box player. And that was a little bit surprising to me. But when you watch the film, it kind of supports it. So you're kind of like, oh, well, if that's all you think he is, then what makes him different than Sidney Brown? Right? Sidney Brown, this kid from Illinois, who's also a very excellent box player, who's also a little bit more physical at taking on blocks, also a little bit more physical tackler. So you kind of say, well, if that's not as valuable as a guy who can play the post, nickel, play outside corner, and that's why I had a little higher evaluation for Quan for this team. In terms of players, I think they wish they trained up for. I'm pretty positive. I don't know this for sure, but Steve Avila and Matthew Bergeron, right?
Yeah.
They go 5 and 7 in the round. And I just think those are the guys that they were eyeballing. And I know they tried to trade up in the second round. I don't know the details. I don't know who it was for, but I would imagine, just looking at the board right now, those are the guys that they were like, we got to get up there and try to get one of those guys. And obviously it just fell through. So I think that's if I had to put money on it, that's who I'd say they were trying to get up for.
Yeah. Did you, by the way, catch Mike Jones with Sheehan yesterday saying that if Richardson had fallen, they might have tried to trade up to 7 to get him?
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
There was the report from Breer right before the draft that Marty Herney really, really liked Richardson. Not sure how pervasive that thought was through the rest of the staff.
Yeah.
And who was talking to who, and leaks out, whatever.
Well,
but that's interesting for sure.
You bring up a really good point there. So you're around the building, and guys, this year they weren't very talkative because I think they were trying to keep their list pretty close to the vest. But in years past, you can catch a guy and start talking to him. Like, oh, hey, what do you think of so-and-so? Anthony Richardson, let's say hypothetically. And someone's like, oh, I think he's garbage. I think he's a 5th round pick, whatever, hypothetically.
Yeah.
And then you talk to somebody literally 5 steps later, it's like, oh, he's the best quarterback in the class. He'll go number 1 overall, And so just when you get those little sound bites from one person, they sometimes aren't the truth for the organization, just to bring that up. So.
Right. And it also is the kind of thing where you,
and again, I got to say this.
Yeah.
No one told me anything about Anthony Richardson. That was a hypothetical example.
Yes.
No one told me anything about the draft this year. They were all very tight-lipped. I'm talking just as an example, just to make that perfectly clear.
And it is the kind of thing where you wonder, as people look at this ownership situation, it's like, are we all going to need jobs in a year? And it's well, I'm going to go ahead and leak out that I like this guy because that way someone else is like, oh, well, if Sam Howell goes down in flames, it's like, well, I wanted to trade up and draft Richardson. I don't know. I mean, especially when you're not the primary decision maker, and you can say that kind of stuff.
Say whatever you want.
There's no real consequences for it. So there's your media hypothetical shenanigans at the end of the podcast. All right, next week we're going to go deep on the NFC East, the drafts there, all 4 of them. Well, obviously we've went pretty deep on one already in Washington, but the other 3 teams, and then see how the division stacks up. We'll also be closing in on rookie mini camp, so that'll be exciting. And we'll see if we can get another guest on to talk about everything as well. So that's next week. For now, make sure that you have liked if you are watching on YouTube, and subscribed whether you are watching or listening YouTube anywhere else, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the always free Odyssey app. I'll see you all on the radio from 4 to 7 for the Hoffman Show and the Team 980. Make sure you're following all the Commander stuff on YouTube for Logan, and following him on Instagram at Logan_Paulson82. For Logan, I'm Craig. We'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.